Israel is blamed for blocking aid deliveries to Gaza, an accusation the government denies. So, what mechanisms are in place for Israel to ensure food and humanitarian assistance reaches the millions of people the UN says are at risk of starvation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Before Israel's war, most of the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza were already dependent on humanitarian assistance. After 4.5 months of a total siege compounded by an intense bombing campaign, the situation is dire. Access to aid has been a major aspect of the conflict. Israel first blocking it, then maintaining tight control over deliveries, and now it's accusing UN agencies of failing to distribute it, all while its forces attack the Strip from the air, ground, and sea. So, how does humanitarian aid enter Gaza? Dmitry Medvedenko explains.
Humanitarian assistance for Gaza goes through a lengthy logistical process before it reaches the millions of Palestinians who so desperately need it. Step 1. It needs to get to the border. Gaza is a narrow strip of land on the Mediterranean bordering Egypt and Israel. Hundreds of trucks wait for hours and sometimes days at these checkpoints, Nitzana and Karam Abu Salem. Step 2. After Israeli inspections, all United Nations deliveries are sent through the Karam Abu Salem crossing, while non-UN aid is currently being rerouted to Egypt and enters via the Rafah crossing. Step 3. The supplies are offloaded on the Gaza side of the border, collected by humanitarian agencies, sorted and then distributed across the Strip. There are hurdles at each stage. At the borders, Israeli protesters have been trying to delay deliveries, despite the government designating the crossings as a military zone. The security inspections are conducted by COGAT, the Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, a unit of the Israeli Defense Department. It decides what is allowed into Gaza and what's banned. The same unit is responsible for overseeing Israeli policies in the occupied West Bank. International aid agencies have increasingly warned of famine in Gaza, accusing Israel of blocking the entry of food and much-needed supplies. But the head of COGAT unit has refuted the accusations, saying this:
"The problem lies with the international organization processing and receiving the aid. There is no food shortage in Gaza."
Yet families are eating animal feed and parents are skipping meals to ensure their children have something to eat. And the UN's food agency, a lifeline to millions of Palestinians, has suspended its operations. And convoys have come under fire, despite coordinating their routes with the Israeli military. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from London is Andreas Krieg, an associate professor of security studies at King's College London. He specializes in security and strategy in the Middle East. In occupied East Jerusalem is Sarah Davies, spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Israel and the occupied territories. The ICRC has operated in the region since 1967. And in Oslo, Raymond Johansen is the Secretary General of Norwegian People's Aid, which has provided humanitarian assistance in the Gaza Strip for more than 35 years. He's also a former Norwegian State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Sarah, let me start with you today. Could you explain to our viewers just how the ICRC is involved in the ongoing efforts to get more aid into Gaza? For example, what exactly does the ICRC do as far as speaking with specific bodies, negotiating with specific Israeli government bodies, and what kind of access are you getting?
Thank you so much for having me on. So firstly, I think it's very important just to clarify that as the International Committee of the Red Cross, we are not negotiating as such, but we do, of course, engage with parties to the conflict, as well as other actors, other institutions, other states, and really anyone who has influence over this situation. We are heavily focused on our humanitarian diplomacy, which does include speaking directly to the parties to this conflict, including, of course, Israel and Hamas, and reminding them of first and foremost, their obligations under international humanitarian law. For Israel as the occupying power in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territory, they have the obligation to ensure that civilians have access to necessities, things like food and safe drinking water, as well as shelter. These are all part of our ongoing discussions with them and the relationships that we've built, having been here for so many decades.
Sarah, obviously the ICRC has a very long history of difficult negotiations with warring parties around the world. This is according to these long-held principles of the organization. How does this compare, what we're seeing in Gaza, the kinds of discussions that you're having right now, when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy? How much more difficult is it compared to other conflicts in the past?
So, yeah, as you said, we have worked in many different conflicts all over the world. I think every conflict has its own challenges, but this particular conflict, as we have all seen, has had a very intense few months of hostilities, and this has severely impacted the people, the civilians on the ground in Gaza who, are not part of this fight. We have seen as well in this day and age the very fast spread of information on social media, which unfortunately can have an impact on states and authorities and other organizations' knowledge of the situation. And unfortunately, it does have an impact at times on our operations on the ground. As I said, we have long-standing relationships with both Hamas and Israel as the parties to this conflict. And while I can't go into the content of that discussion, as a discrete organization, as that neutral organization that we are regularly in contact with them, consistently discussing all different aspects of this conflict, our concerns, what we're seeing on the ground, and we will continue to do so.
Raymond, what mechanisms are in place for Israel to ensure food and humanitarian assistance reaches the millions of people that the UN say are at risk of starvation in Gaza?
First of all, I think it's important to say that our staff in Gaza, they are, as from other organizations, displaced themselves. And most of our people are from Gaza City. And but for the time being, the resources is very limited. They are doing their best to setting up some latrines and for women and children. And at the same time, we find that the aid workers are subjects to direct attack. And so are also the health institution, the humanitarian sites. And so it's extremely difficult for the time being to do any humanitarian assistance. And as the representatives from the Israeli government say that there are no food shortage in Gaza, that's of course free fantasy. It is food shortage in Gaza. And even before the 7th of October, 80% of the population in Gaza was dependent on aid. And now with the blockades and just the Rafah crossing and the Kerem Shalom crossing operate with a minimum capacity, with a lot of restriction. It sets itself, the bombing must stop, and we have to open up for more sites to bring in humanitarian assistance. And it's extremely difficult situation for the people who lives on a very, very small area, which is different from other conflict. This is small area with 2 million people in the biggest prison in the world. So it's important to take that into account as well.
Raymond, let me follow up with you about another point. The Palestinian Red Crescent is warning that a number of people in Gaza have died as a result of Israel's deliberate starvation and famine in Gaza. Is what we are seeing now, from your perspective, is it war by starvation, and are Israel's actions causing famine?
Of course, that's the consequence of the bombing. That's the consequence of the lack of access for humanitarian assistance. And we saw also the northern part of Gaza is now basically an IDF military zone. So it means that it's also difficult or almost impossible to go back to see if there's possible to find, to harvest some food, to find some food. The fishery, it's impossible. So it totally depends on humanitarian assistance.
Andreas, we heard in Dimitri's report earlier, he was talking about a body known as COGAT. That's short for the Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories. It's a unit of the Israeli Defense Department. I want to ask you more specifically, what is COGAT and how does it work?
Right. I mean, COGAT sounds civilian, but as you already said, is a unit in the Ministry of Defense. It's run by the military. It's run by a military officer. It's staffed by military officers, and it's an executive body of the IDF to actually implement occupation. So we have to understand that obviously occupation was supposed to be phased out after Oslo. It didn't happen. So this was sort of an interim body to facilitate the military side, the civilian side of the military occupation. But COGAT responds and answers to the military. It's answering to a military body and the Central Command. It implements military strategy, so it's not a civilian body. And as such, also we see that it's obviously responsible for all the choke points, for all the flows of data, of people, of aid, of goods, financial services, anything that goes in and out of the occupied territories, and that includes the West Bank and Gaza. And as such, it's in many ways, when it comes to Gaza, the prison gatekeeper, because it kind of keeps the gates and controls the most important choke points for aid, for people, for capital, for any sort of flows going in and out of Gaza. And whatever goes through the Rafah crossing, which they now control increasingly as well, is usually not controlled by COGAT, but is punished when it goes through there. So they're trying to implement, they've tried to create a situation where they control flows of people in particular there as well. But it's absolutely a pivotal point and a crucial element of military occupation. And the fact that they control everything that goes to the Erez crossing as well as Kerem HaShalom in the south, and enforcing, that's very important, enforcing the blockade means that they're very much not just complicit, but they're a crucial part of that blockade. They're crucial in controlling that territory, and that makes the IDF and the military and the Ministry of Defense as well very much a party that occupies the Gaza Strip, even if they don't control the day-to-day operations on the ground. You should, maybe in terms of illustrating that, I would say that COGAT is in many ways the national government, while what Hamas is doing domestically is more like a municipality government, because they're completely tied and controlled by what COGAT is doing in terms of information flows, flows of people and flows of money and goods.
So, Andreas, if we can follow this train of thought a little bit further, Israel is being blamed by many aid agencies for blocking aid deliveries to Gaza. Of course, the Israeli government denies those accusations. But then you also have COGAT, officials with COGAT, who are saying essentially that the problem doesn't lie with them, that the problem lies with international organizations. And they say that international organizations need to do more to ensure the flow of aid into Gaza. How do you make sense of these statements from COGAT leadership saying that the UN could do more to get aid in? Essentially pushing blame onto the UN or other NGOs or aid agencies, while as you're saying, they're actually the ones in control.
No, I mean, this is obviously a part of that information campaign. It's a way of deflecting responsibility away from COGAT. COGAT has been on a massive information campaign in the United States with some of their senior members going around speaking to people and saying, look, we're doing everything that we can, but it's not our fault. In reality, considering that they are the gatekeepers, the prison gatekeepers of Gaza, in many ways they do control what's going on. And it's part of that information campaign that we've seen in Western capitals run by Israeli information networks to kind of blame the UN and UN agencies of saying they're insufficient, they're undermined by Hamas, they're complicit in whatever is going on, whatever happened on the 7th of October. And so that's part of that information campaign, and COGAT is integrated into that overall strategy. But COGAT isn't a strategic, so it's still, because it reports to the military, it's not a civilian institution that is next to the military. It is answering to the same military strategy. And as Raymond said already before, military humanitarian aid has become weaponized. It become a tool of statecraft, a tool of warfare by the Israelis, and COGAT therefore has become part of that same military strategy of attacking not just Hamas and the Hamas infrastructure, but also the civilians that live in Gaza. And as such, COGAT is very much complicit in that. And I would see any of these kind of information campaigns as part of a wider effort to discredit the international community and especially NGOs and the humanitarian community.
Raymond, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Andreas was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to drop in, and I think it's fair also to mention the catastrophic impact of freezing of funds to UNRWA. UNRWA was responsible for all the infrastructure for receiving humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and now we see the freezing funds that UNRWA is not able to do their work. They have also been very instrumental to the rest of the humanitarian family because they had the infrastructure. So no 20 countries or so still are freezing the funds. So this is very, very dramatic. And that's also the part of the ongoing PR campaign that everyone who has been involved in Gaza from the humanitarian side, if it's NGOs, if it's UN, they to blame and indirectly say that they are supporting groups that we are not supporting because we are doing the humanitarian assistance. And we're trying to build up and strengthen the civil democratic society, which is also a prerequisite for trying to find a more peaceful solution. First, we also have to strengthen that because it will not be sustainable if we are just flushing in a lot of aid without any control. And we know that in Gaza these days, the law and order, of course, it's almost impossible to prevail. So we need access. At the same time, to see that we are partners that are doing our best to trying to save lives in extreme critical situation for the population in Gaza these days.
Sarah, before October 7th, you had around 500 trucks of aid that would enter Gaza daily. And even then, most of the population depended on humanitarian assistance. Of course, things have grown much more dire, and the drop-off, it's been precipitous when it comes to the number of trucks that go in. Everyone knows not enough relief is getting into Gaza. What are the priorities right now, and why isn't it getting to the people who need it?
There definitely is not enough entry of aid into Gaza right now. For us at the International Committee of the Red Cross, one of the main priorities is medical care, medical supplies, and medical equipment. Right now, there is, I would say, no functioning health system in Gaza, and there are increasing concerns and increasing rates of things like infectious diseases on top of those who have been wounded and require ongoing care, ongoing dressing changes. You know, people already lived with chronic diseases and disabilities before the 7th of October, before this escalation began. There are still people who require their regular medication, things like dialysis and cancer treatment, chemotherapy, that has now been had immense pressure added to it because there are so many thousands of people who have been severely wounded, who are exposed to the elements in Gaza right now, living in tents in a very small area in about 20% of the entirety of the Gaza Strip. And this is really just a hotbed of public health concerns. I think there are many challenges and many reasons why supplies are not reaching people. The first is that there is such a vast array of needs. You know, individual people, individual families have different needs. And to even be able to go through that and try and address each need is a challenge in and of itself. There are, of course, the security concerns. Our team has been impacted by security incidents. Our team was, unfortunately, in November fired upon. I know other humanitarian organizations have had similar incidents. And the logistics. There are no passable roads in Gaza, or very few passable roads. They're littered with rubble. There are the concerns of unexploded ordnances hiding in this rubble that people are not able to tell where it is. And of course, there is very little access to those civilians who are still in the north.
Sarah, let me also ask you, you're talking about, the logistics and how difficult it is. And on that note, there are reports now that the UK and Canada have started to airdrop supplies to northern Gaza because they say it's impossible to get aid in there. From your perspective, is that a sustainable or efficient way of delivering aid? And is it really impossible to the extent that that's the only way that aid could get in?
So airdrops are something that we at the ICRC have used in the past in different conflicts around the world. And we're very pleased, of course, that this means that some in the north will receive the medical supplies that I believe were dropped. But airdrops do come with their own, set of challenges. Apart from the logistics, things like that, there needs to be large areas that are not filled with people, that do not have objects in the way. It is a very expensive, and so therefore I'm unsure how sustainable that would be for multiple attempts. There's always the small potential that things break on impact. It really depends on what's in these airdrops. Is it medical equipment that's very sensitive? Is it supplies? Is it bags of rice or flour? There are their own challenges with airdrops. On the impossibility of gaining access to the north, I don't know if I would call it impossible in a general sense, but safely, absolutely not right now. It's very complex, very challenging for any organizations to go to the north or return from the north. This is, as I said, there's all those logistics like the rubble, the unexploded ordinances, but it is an active conflict zone. There is still fighting ongoing. There are still, missiles and rockets flying back and forth. There is at times hand-to-hand combat, fighting in different areas. Telecommunications is a huge challenge for teams to be able to even communicate their pathways where they are. That's a really big challenge for anyone who is attempting to gain access to the north right now.
Andreas, I want to explore a bit more about COGAT because this is a complicated issue and there is a lot of confusion about how exactly aid gets in. We were talking earlier about COGAT being a body within the Defense Ministry. You were saying it's part of the military structure. From your perspective, would things be at all easier if something like COGAT were shifted under a civilian-controlled structure, or would that perhaps complicate things further, maybe even politicize the matter further?
No, in a normal country, in a normal liberal democracy, I would say, yes, this sort of agency should be under civilian control, shouldn't be run by the military. When you look at, what happened in our counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan executed by Western countries, we kind of try to shift governance back to a civilian body fairly swiftly. The problem in Israel is obviously, and there has been quite a lot of debate in recent months, to kind of shift COGAT away from the Ministry of Defense to no one less than the Minister of Finance, Schmortich, who himself is obviously a settler. He's a convicted offender as well in that space, and obviously is highly politicized, has a huge interest in making sure that COGAT is actually no longer cooperating. And as we are criticizing COGAT quite rightly for what it does as a gatekeeper to let aid into Gaza, things would be far worse if COGAT was not controlled by the military, but would actually be controlled by a highly politicized ministry, such as the Ministry of Finance, which would respond to a radical like Schmortich, who in his own views would love to continue with ethnic cleansing, kind of create a situation where Gazans would no longer be able and allowed to live in the Gaza Strip, and would instrumentalize COGAT for exactly that same reason. Hence why the military has been pushing back.
Raymond, there is confusion when it comes to reporting how much aid is actually getting into Gaza. There seem to be a lot of discrepancies in the numbers that have been posted and reported by different bodies. How difficult is it to actually decipher how many aid trucks are getting into Gaza these days?
Earlier in the discussions today, we heard that usually before the 7th of October, it was 500 trucks each day. No, it's some days it's no trucks, some other days it's up to 20, maybe 100, and then down to 0 the day after. So the overall perspective is that there is a limit of humanitarian assistance. It's almost nothing. So I think it's a saying, in war, the first victim is the truth. and this is also the truth in this war. We're trying to say that, well, it's not that serious, it's not the blockade, it's still, as we heard in the earlier discussion today, there are no food shortage in Gaza. Of course, what is the consequences? 30,000 has been killed. They have been killed since 7th of October. 80% depend on that. So it's limitation, it's difficulties, but we know that it's coming.
Raymond.
Yes.
Raymond, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We just have about a minute and a half left. I also want to ask you about the fact that when it comes to the concern about being able to operate in Gaza and distribute aid, we heard in the last couple of days that the World Food Program is going to be halting aid deliveries in the northern part of Gaza. How much concern is there about that right now? And do you believe that perhaps even Norwegian People's Aid will have to halt distribution of aid in the north of Gaza because of security concerns too going forward?
Yeah, that's true. We hope that it will. We need some more international humanitarian workers into Gaza. We think that also for security reasons it will be good. We have heard news about that World Food Program that they have in pipeline, food for two months more to go, which is possible, but still access is the main problem. Now we have to see that both Airdrops crossing near Gaza City must be open, Karni crossing can be open, and at the same time we have Rafah crossing and Kerem Shalom crossing, which is necessary because it's limited access for the people who lives in Gaza to move from north to south and east to west. So we need to have more access.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Andreas Krieg, Sarah Davies, and Raymond Johansen. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.